Hey everybody, today I'm going to react to a Vice video in which people debate the US education system. Should be interesting, so let's check it out.
What's the purpose of education?
I think the purpose of education is twofold. One, to help build and support the individual, but also help build and support society as a whole. Because even though you may not have a kid in education, you pay taxes to public school because we as a society depend on and need education for society to work.
Yeah, okay, so a dual purpose, build the individual and then build society.
I think the purpose of education is to educate and not indoctrinate. And I think that in a lot of ways we've strayed from that in the original purpose of what it's supposed to be.
I think it should be intelligence and character. I think you should be able to understand the world around you and understand who you are and your purpose and try to make the world a better place. I think that it has to be a mix of the skills, memorizing the formulas, understanding the world around you, but then also what to do with it.
And just to go off that, the idea that education, you have to balance the importance of memorizing the quadratic formula while simultaneously addressing social and political issues respectively. So children have both the know-how, general knowledge, and also kind of self-awareness and character so they're able to develop their own opinions.
Yeah, I think that the purpose of education is to understand the world that you exist in and use that understanding as a means for creating change or even understanding yourself on a deeper level.
Yeah, I wonder if the liberal participants tend to have more of an activist mindset, right? So they'll see education as a way to educate the next generation of activists, right? Because there are obstacles and there are problems in the world, and we need people to address and fix those problems. And the way that you do that, or one of the main ways that you do that, is to educate young people.
I believe the purpose is simply just to prepare the individual to be successful in the society that they exist in.
Critical thinking.
All right, so that's a little more conservative, right? It's just preparing the individual to be successful. Now, he didn't define what he means by successful, but it's not anything about changing society.
Thinking, learn how to live out your full potential so you can be independent, and everything else really flows from there.
The purpose of education is to prepare children for the real life and also make sure that they are literate.
So I think the purpose is to raise the next generation of leaders. And when you think about what you want your leaders to be like, you want them to be knowledgeable and you want them to be compassionate. You want them to be self-aware. You want them to understand the best way to move forward, not just for themselves personally, but for their whole community.
Okay, right. So then that gives me the impression that this person has more of a liberal mindset, right? You want them to be future leaders. And what do leaders do? They lead, they make changes. Ideally, they would fix problems, right? So it's not just about the individual. It's about making society a better place.
When we talk about who's doing the educating, who should decide what's being taught?
Parents. I think that parents should have a huge say in what's going on in the classroom because it's their kids, not ours. As a public school teacher 15 years, I was always aware that these are not my children. We have to make sure that we're respecting parents and their beliefs and their values.
I think the Constitution agrees with that.
Yes.
Here in America, ranging back to the early 1900s, plenty of Supreme Court cases have ruled in that favor that it is the parents' right ultimately.
I completely respect your idea of it is not our job as educators to put forth a belief in front of children, right? That includes not perpetuating parents' beliefs in the classroom as well. In my opinion, that would be keeping a non-biased viewpoint, simply presenting issues, and then allowing kids to decide for themselves.
Oh, okay. So this person wants the kids to be independent thinkers. The teacher presents both sides of the issue, and they inform the students what the arguments are, and then have the students decide for themselves. Yeah, I generally agree with that approach.
The voices of parents need to be heard in that equation. But unfortunately, what we've seen recently is that parents' voices have been demonized in this process. You've seen parents who've criticized local school boards labeled terrorists simply for caring about the quality of their education that their child is receiving. These teachers are temporary caretakers. When they come back home, it's the parent who has to explain that this is this radical belief that was put in front of you. This was this idea that you've never been raised around that parent now has to explain. And at the end of the day, that isn't just confined to a classroom. Now it's bleeding into their upbringing. And there's only one person responsible for their upbringing, and that's the parents. It's not the educators, not the teacher, it's their parents.
Okay, so the sense that I'm getting from this guy is that there is some sort of tension between what parents want and I guess what teachers want the kids to know, right? So maybe he thinks that the teachers are liberal and they're all on the left, And so they're teaching leftist values to their kids. And he himself, as a conservative, doesn't like that. And so he has to almost counter all of their efforts. So it's giving him more work to do at home. Like he has to inform their kids that they've been indoctrinated or something like that. Now, in regards to the general idea of parents having the power to decide what their kids learn in school, you can kind of imagine, I can imagine both sides agreeing to something like that. But the reason why perhaps conservatives have a problem with it is because they think that there is a liberal bias in school and that their kids are being indoctrinated by liberal values, right? But you can imagine a situation being switched, right? You can imagine maybe a child attending a conservative school, perhaps with some sort of religious affiliation, and that liberal parent thinking, no, I should have the power to decide what my kid gets taught, and maybe that liberal parent doesn't like all the religious stuff.
Giving kids the exposure to other ideas or other things that they wouldn't be exposed to otherwise is, I think, part of what's going to help raise the next generation of people that are able to look outside their own lived experience.
But I think that oftentimes those different ideas are presented in the classroom as a student as the only idea. When you're being taught that, oh, there's this many genders or anything like this, where you haven't been exposed to that in your own household, it's being presented as like the end-all be-all when it actually isn't. It's about educating and not indoctrinating. As long as that is presented as a counterpoint to, well, there's people who believe this, but there's also people who believe this, that's okay. The reality of it is that in most classrooms across the country, that isn't what's happening.
I think what's difficult about having these type of discussions is that not every person in whatever group is going to think exactly the same, right? So perhaps you have one liberal teacher who teaches one particular way, and that liberal teacher teaches differently than how a different liberal teacher would teach, okay? And the perceptions that the conservatives have of teachers in general is maybe of this one type of liberal teacher that wants to indoctrinate your kids, kind of like, it's almost like a boogeyman. Perhaps this other person who's speaking is saying, well, like that's not how I teach. And maybe the people who I know who are also teachers don't teach like that, right? It's kind of difficult to have that type of discussion if you're lumping everybody into the same group, right? This is why I think generally it's easier to address an issue if we're just breaking down the claims that people are making rather than putting people into categories.
If you can't talk about God in the classroom, why can we talk about every gender under the sun, right? I think that's the conundrum that we find ourselves in. If we are banning those conversations, we've banned those a long time ago, then how can we have these conversations just because they belong to a different side of the political aisle?
I don't have a problem with God being discussed at school, honestly. I mean, it could be discussed in a religion class, right? A teacher can say, oh, there are people in the world who are Christian, they believe this. There are people in the world who are Hindu and they believe that. I don't see a problem with that.
I think we actually talk about God in the classroom all the time, right?
Yeah.
Who's taught religion? Who's taught world religions? Who's taught like history in the way that, Puritans, and that's okay, because God is part of the fabric of history and whatever else.
We talk about it from a development perspective. This is how Christianity originated. This is how Islam originated. We don't talk about like, this is what this gender is, and this is if you feel this way, then there's gender affirmation therapy, all those things.
I think you actually bring up a really good parallel of like, I feel comfortable and I feel like it is okay to talk about identity issues the same way we talk about God.
Why do you think homeschooling is the best option?
Well, if we look at the history of this country, a lot of people were homeschooled. A lot of our founders were homeschooled. Like they only went to school till third grade, a lot of them. And I think what has happened is parents have decided that the government is going to do a better job at raising their children than themselves. We have also come to a place where school is taking up the majority of our day. And we have this mistrust of parents that they can't educate their own children. And I think that that's wrong. I think that a lot of parents, and if you look at homeschool data, like my friend Phil right here, he's got 7 kids and he's homeschooling them all. And actually homeschool kids are turning out really well.
I think you bring up a lot of very valid points, but I have to say, and I just want your opinion on this, I would never homeschool my own kids. And I want my kids to be smarter than me, than I ever was. How am I going to have a child that is smarter and does better than I do if I'm their only teacher?
Yeah. You grow
So apparently a lot of people who are homeschooled, they're like what we imagine, or, I went to public school. What we imagine to be homeschooling is very different than a lot of people's actual homeschooling experiences. As far as I can tell, a lot of people who are homeschooled are actually part of kind of like their own school system. It's like an informal school system. So it's not just the parents teaching the kids, right? The parents may teach the kids one subject, and then the kids go to a different house or something like that with different parents, and those parents teach the kid another subject.
The school is is considered one of those shared spaces, one of those last kind of shared spaces where you might bump into someone who maybe comes from a different background than you, has a different ideology than you. What do you lose if you homeschool and then you're not putting yourself in these kind of situations?
What you lose is negative influences. One of the biggest things I think when it comes to homeschool is keeping my kids away from your bad kids. We've went and taken our children to pride parades. And you know what I mean? We've been there, we've been loving, and we showed support to the people there. But at the same time, we explain our views on the matter that we believe marriage is between a man and a woman.
This person doesn't sound like that he wants a balanced view presented to his kids, right? Like perhaps this person is religious. And so he wants his kids to be religious, or he wants his kids to have particular values. So he wants to instill those values onto his kids. And that, honestly, that's probably true for the vast majority of parents, right? Liberal parents want their kids to be liberal, probably. Right. So I think the question was, what do you lose out if you homeschool, right? And he says, well, I'm isolating my kids from your bad kids, right? I'm protecting my kids from your kids' bad influence. I can understand why he thinks that way, but at the same time, there's just only so many things that you can do and expose them to on your own, right? So I think your kids would probably miss out on that stuff as well, that I don't think are negative. All right, well, that was the video about the U.S. education system. I thought it was interesting. I really encourage people having these conversations, because I think it's important for us to kind of break out of our echo chambers to get a better understanding of what the other side thinks. Because I think once we do that, we'll find out that we actually have more in common than we originally thought. If you guys have any comments, please leave them down below, and I'll see you all next time.